You know when people tell you that some things should just be left alone? Yeah, I wish I'd listened. So this happened about 5 years ago when I was still living in my home village in Nigeria. It's one of those places where people know everybody's business and nothing much happens. Well, until it does. There's this part of the village that's avoided by most people, especially at night. It's just a patch of forest, but we all call it Ekwensu's path. The elders say it's been cursed for generations. Something about a spirit who lives there, the kind that doesn't like being disturbed. My grandma used to tell me and my cousins stories about it when we were kids. You know, the usual don't go there or the spirits will take you type of stuff. We all laughed it off back then. I wish I hadn't. Now, I'm not the superstitious type, or at least I didn't used to be. But one night I found myself heading home late after a party. I wasn't drunk, just a little tipsy, but I remember everything like it happened yesterday. Instead of taking the long, safe way back, I decided to cut through Ekwensu's path. I thought it was all just stories, right? It was around 1 a.m. and the village was quiet. No breeze, no crickets, just stillness. The moon was barely out and the path was darker than I'd imagined. I had my phone, but the battery was dying, so I used its weak flashlight to see a few steps ahead. As soon as I entered the forest, the air changed. You ever feel like you're being watched? Yeah, that feeling hit me hard, but I kept walking. The trees seemed to close in around me, the branches reaching out like bony hands. The further I went, the quieter it got. Not a single sound except for my own footsteps. No wind, no birds, no animals, nothing. That's when I started hearing it. At first, it was just a faint whisper like the wind, but there was no wind. I stopped, listening, my heart pounding. The whisper got louder, almost like someone was standing right behind me, breathing in my ear. I turned around, shining my phone's flashlight, but there was nothing there, just trees. But I wasn't alone, I could feel it. Now I know what you're thinking. Turn back, right? But for some reason, I didn't. I don't know if it was stubbornness or that same stupid curiosity that gets people into horror movie situations, but I kept going. Big mistake. About halfway through the path, I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a woman standing off to the side, leaning against one of the trees. She looked like she was in trouble. Her clothes were tattered, like she'd been out there for a while. Her skin was pale, almost too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years, and her hair was a mess, long and tangled. But it was her eyes that did it, or rather the lack of them. They were hollow black holes where her eyes should have been. I froze, staring at her, trying to process what I was seeing. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring, or at least I felt like she was staring right at me. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck, locked in place. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl, too wide, like her face was stretching. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it echoed in my head, making it hard to think. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. I couldn't respond. My throat was dry, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. She stepped closer, slow, deliberate, her feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. And as she got closer, I could see more of her face. Her skin wasn't just pale, it was cracked, like old pottery, with tiny fissures running along her cheeks. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I broke free of whatever hold she had on me and bolted. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, just running, crashing through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't care, I just needed to get out. And I did. Somehow, I made it back to the main road, panting, covered in sweat. The village was still dead silent, but the second I crossed out of Ekwensu's path, I felt the air shift again, like I'd stepped out of a nightmare. But the weird thing? My phone was dead, completely drained. I'd left with at least 30% battery. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. For weeks after, I felt like I was being watched, especially at night. I'd see shadows in my room, flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye. And then, one night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed, smiling that same twisted smile. I moved to Lagos the next day. But the story doesn't end there. See, I thought leaving the village would be the end of it. The day I arrived in Lagos, I felt lighter, as if I'd left that nightmare behind. For a while, things were okay. I got a job, rented a small apartment, and tried to forget everything that had happened. But that's the thing with spirits, they don't let you forget. A few months after moving, the nightmares began. They were always the same. Me standing in that dark forest, hearing the whispers, and then seeing her emerge from the shadows with that wide, cracked smile. Every time I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I could feel her presence, even though she wasn't physically there. Then the real strange stuff started happening. Objects in my apartment would move. I'd place something down, and a few minutes later, it'd be in a different spot. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. But then I started hearing things. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of someone breathing right next to me when I was alone. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door slightly open, even though I always locked it before bed. One night, things escalated. I woke up to the sound of scratching at my window. It was around 3 a.m. and I lived on the 3rd floor, so there was no way it could have been an animal. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to get up and check. I pulled back the curtain and there she was, the woman with the hollow eyes. She was standing on the fire escape, her face pressed against the glass, smiling that same terrifying smile. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. When I looked again, she was gone, but the glass was fogged up as if someone had been breathing on it. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and moved out of the apartment, staying with a friend for a few days. I've moved 3 times since then, and every time she finds me. It doesn't matter how far I go, she's always there, watching, waiting. I've tried everything: prayers, rituals, even talking to a pastor who specializes in exorcisms, but nothing works. She's still here, lurking in the shadows, showing up in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. I live with the fear that one day I'll wake up and she'll be there standing at the foot of my bed again, and this time I won't be able to run. Chinedu didn't ask me any more questions. He just nodded like he understood and said we'd figure it out. He called his uncle the next day, an old dibia, or traditional healer, who lived in a village a few hours away. I didn't believe in all that before, but at this point I was willing to try anything. We went to see the old man the next morning. His house was deep in the countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of Lagos. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was how calm the place felt, almost peaceful. The air smelled of herbs and wood smoke, and there was a stillness to the place that was strangely comforting. Chinedu's uncle, a tall, wiry man with piercing eyes, greeted us without saying much. He led us inside his small, dark house where the walls were lined with dried herbs, animal skulls, and strange carvings. The smell of incense was thick in the air. After I told him my story, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the floor. Finally, he spoke. "You have crossed into a realm that does not forgive easily. The spirits are angry. The woman you saw is not just any spirit. She is a guardian, a keeper of things we should not touch." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me?" He looked at me for a moment. "But understand this. What you have done cannot be undone. You can only appease her, not escape her." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I didn't care. I just wanted this nightmare to end. He took us outside, to a small clearing behind his house, and began preparing a ritual. He drew strange symbols in the dirt and placed offerings around the perimeter, small bowls of cola nuts, palm wine, and something that looked like blood, though I didn't ask what kind. Then he lit a fire in the center and began to chant. The whole time I felt uneasy, like something was watching us. The air grew thick and the wind picked up, swirling around us in a way that made my skin prickle. It was like the forest itself was waking up. As the chanting grew louder, I saw movement in the trees. At first it was just shadows, but then I saw her. The woman with the hollow eyes standing at the edge of the clearing watching us. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared with that empty gaze. Chinedu's uncle didn't stop. He kept chanting, louder and louder, until the air was vibrating with the sound. The woman stepped closer, her expression blank, but I could feel her anger, like a wave of heat washing over me. Suddenly, the fire in the center of the clearing flared up, bright and hot. The wind roared, and for a moment I thought I heard her scream. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The wind stopped, the fire died down, and the woman was gone. Chinedu's uncle turned to me, his face tired but calm. "It is done," he said. "Is she gone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "Number, but she will not come for you again. Not if you respect what has been done here." I didn't fully understand, but I nodded. I was just relieved it was over. We left the village that evening, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight on my chest was gone. The constant feeling of being watched had faded, but the old man's words stuck with me. You can only appease her, not escape her. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right and the shadows dance in the corners of my room, I still feel her. Not close, but not far away either. Watching, waiting. I know now that some things can't be outrun. No matter how far you go, they become a part of you, lurking in the background, a reminder of what you've seen and what you've done. And while she may never come for me again, I'll always carry the memory of those hollow eyes and that twisted smile. So, if you're ever in my village, remember what I've told you. Don't go down Ekwensu's path. Some things are better left undisturbed, and that's the story. It's been years, but I can still feel her presence sometimes. After that night at Chinedu's uncle's place, things were calm for a while. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, without seeing her twisted smile in my dreams. I went back to my regular life, though I was more cautious. I didn't talk about the experience much, only Chinedu knew the full story, and even he never brought it up. But like they say, the past has a way of catching up with you. I didn't realize it at the time, but my connection to that spirit wasn't as severed as I thought. It was more like she was lying dormant, waiting for the right moment. It was about a year later when it started again. By then, I'd moved into my own place, a small apartment in the heart of Lagos. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Work was going well. I was dating someone new, and life felt normal again. I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing with the woman in the forest had been taken care of. But then the dreams returned. At first, they were subtle. I'd find myself back on Ekwensu's path, walking through the dense forest, the same eerie silence hanging in the air. But unlike before, she wasn't immediately there. It was like she was hiding, watching from the shadows, waiting for me to make a move. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but I'd convince myself it was just a nightmare, nothing more. Then one night, I dreamt that I was back at Chinedu's uncle's place. The clearing behind his house was empty, the fire pit cold, but something felt off. The sky was dark, darker than it should have been, and the trees around me seemed taller, more twisted. I heard the sound of chanting, just like the night of the ritual, but this time it was different, more sinister. I turned, and there she was, the woman with the hollow eyes, standing at the edge of the clearing, but she wasn't alone this time. Shadows moved behind her, vague shapes that twisted and morphed in the darkness. She smiled at me, her lips pulling back too far, her teeth sharp and jagged. "You thought it was over," her voice echoed in my head. "You can't run from me, not forever." I jolted awake, gasping for air, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. I could feel a presence, like the air around me was heavy, pressing down on my chest. I reached for my phone, my hand trembling, and turned on the flashlight. Nothing, just my bedroom, as normal as ever. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I knew she was nearby, even if I couldn't see her. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see her, standing there with that twisted grin. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. I told Chinedu about it, and he suggested we go back to his uncle's place. We drove back to the village the next weekend. When we arrived, something felt off. The air was thick, the kind of humidity that sticks to your skin and makes it hard to breathe. Chinedu's uncle greeted us at the door, his expression serious. I could tell by the look in his eyes that he already knew why we were there. "She's not finished with you," he said before we even sat down. "I warned you. The ritual would only keep her away for a time, but the spirits are persistent." He led us back out to the clearing just like before and started preparing another ritual. This time, though, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the ritual began, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The chanting echoed through the trees, but this time, it wasn't just Chinedu's uncle's voice. I could hear whispers, faint and eerie, coming from the forest around us. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping closer with every passing second. Then, out of nowhere, the fire in the center of the clearing flared up, brighter than before, and a gust of wind nearly knocked me off my feet. I heard a scream. No, not just a scream, a chorus of them, coming from all directions. The shadows surged forward, and in the midst of it all, I saw her, the woman with the hollow eyes. She was different now. Her face was even more distorted, her skin cracked and peeling like old parchment, and behind her, those shadowy figures loomed, growing larger, more solid, as if they were feeding off her rage. "You should never have come back," she hissed. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The shadows closed in, and her hand, bony, clawed, reached out toward me. Just as her fingers grazed my skin, Chinedu's uncle shouted something in a language I didn't understand, and the fire exploded in a burst of light, blinding me. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The shadows had retreated, and the clearing was still, but the feeling of dread lingered. Chinedu's uncle sat down, his face pale and drawn. "She's tied to you now," he said quietly. "There's nothing more I can do." My heart sank. "What do you mean tied to me? You said the ritual would work." "It did, but only for a while. She's no ordinary spirit. She's something far older, something darker. You disturbed her, and now she's bound to you. Wherever you go, she'll follow." The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no escaping her. No matter what I did, no matter where I went, she would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her chance to take me. I didn't know what to say. Chinedu looked at me, his face full of pity, but there was nothing he could do either. I was trapped. We left the village that day, but the feeling of dread didn't leave me. I knew she was still out there, waiting for the right moment. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, those hollow eyes, that twisted smile, the shadows creeping closer. And now, I can hear her voice, whispering in the back of my mind. She's never far away. I've stopped running, there's no point. The truth is, I'm just waiting now, waiting for the day she finally catches me. And when that day comes, I don't know what will happen, but I know it won't be good. So, if you ever hear stories about Ekwensu's path, believe them, because I didn't, and now she's always with me, always watching, and I can't escape.